Throughout the history of the United States, the U.S. presidency has been a stage for innovation, progress, and transformation. And throughout that history, as our nation has evolved, so have the presidents that lead it. Of the 46 presidents to serve the country, each one has had the opportunity to leave their own unique history on the nation. Today, we are going to look at every single president and one thing that they became the first president to do. Starting off with the first president of the United States, George Washington. George Washington was the first and only president to be unanimously elected. Both the election of 1788 and 1792, Washington ran unopposed and won with 100% of the electoral vote. John Adams was the first president to live in the White House. Even though the construction on the White House began in 1792, the building was not complete until November 1st, 1800. The current president, John Adams, moved in, making him the first to live in the most recognizable building in America. Thomas Jefferson was the first president to shake hands. At the time, it was common for political officials to bow to each other as a greeting. Jefferson, being from the South, was more used to shaking hands and would commonly be seen shaking hands of the guests at the White House. Dolley Madison, the First Lady of James Madison, held the first ever Easter egg roll on the White House lawn in 1814. Hundreds of children came with their decorated eggs, and the tradition still continues to this day. James Monroe was the first to ride a steamboat in 1817. Americans began to believe steamboat travel would be the future of American infrastructure, and that same year, the New York legislature approved the funding to the Erie Canal. In March 1843, John Quincy Adams visited Haas's Washington, D.C. studio to become the first president to be photographed. Adams was 76 at the time, which leads most people to believe he looked much older as president than he really did in his 50s. On January 30th, 1835, Andrew Jackson became the first president to attempt to be assassinated. Luckily for him, his attacker's gun misfired twice and allowed Jackson himself to attack his own attacker with his cane. Martin Van Buren was born in New York in 1782, making him the first president to be born after 1776. It's funny to think that the first 7 presidents were born under a now foreign flag. William Henry Harrison was the first president to die in office. I wanted to say something else, but unfortunately there isn't much else Harrison is known for. Soon after taking the oath, Harrison developed pneumonia and passed away just 31 days into his presidency. John Tyler was the only U.S. president to be buried under a foreign flag. After serving in the Confederate Congress and voting for Virginia to secede, Tyler died in Richmond, Virginia in 1862, making him the only president not to be ceremonially buried by United States of America. Surprisingly, James K. Polk was the first president not to have a pet. In fact, every single president has had at least one pet at the White House except for James K. Polk and Donald Trump. Zachary Taylor was a major general in the Mexican-American War, but ascended to the presidency with no political experience, making him the first ever president to not have previously held a political office. In the 1850s, many improvements were made to the White House, including gas heating and cooking and indoor plumbing. Millard Fillmore was the first president to use a gas stove and have a kitchen stove in the White House. Among these new technological advances, Franklin Pierce was able to install a central heating unit using gas in the White House. James Buchanan was the only U.S. president to never marry and didn't have a first lady. Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin in Kentucky in 1809, making him the first president born outside the original 13 colonies. Andrew Johnson was the first president to be impeached. In 1868, the House passed the 11 articles of impeachment, but the Senate voted 35-19 in favor of conviction, one vote shy of the 2/3 required majority. Ulysses S. Grant was the first president to write and publish his memoirs. Shortly before his death in 1885, Grant wrote The Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. The book was extremely popular, and even though Grant didn't live to see it, the book made his family around $450,000, just under $15 million in today's money. In May 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes installed the first telephone at the White House. The phone was a direct line between the White House and the Treasury Department, and the White House's phone number was simply 1. James A. Garfield spoke fluent German and would commonly repeat his speeches in German during his famous front porch campaign in 1880, making him the first president to campaign in 2 different languages. Chester A. Arthur was the first president to use an elevator in the White House. Shortly after his inauguration, Garfield ordered an elevator built, but once he became ill, the construction was stopped. After he had passed and Arthur succeeded him, the project was resumed, and in the fall of 1881, the elevator was completed. Of course, Grover Cleveland is most famous for being the first and only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. Cleveland was elected in 1884 and lost the election of 1888 just to turn around and win again in 1892. Electricity was first installed to the White House in 1891 during Benjamin Harrison's presidency, making him the first to have electricity in the White House. But technically, he never used it himself since he and his family were afraid of being shocked by the switches if they touched them. William McKinley became the first president to ride in an automobile in November of 1899. McKinley reportedly said the ride was uncomfortable and he felt like the car could be blown to bits at any moment. Staying on the topic of transportation, Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to fly in a plane. On October 11, 1910, Roosevelt flew in an early Wright Flyer near St. Louis, Missouri. Even though he wasn't in office at the time, he sparked the beginning of presidential air travel that we know today. William Howard Taft became the first president to throw out a first ceremonial pitch before a baseball game between the Washington Senators and the Philadelphia Athletics on April 14, 1910. When Woodrow Wilson set sail for Europe in 1918, he became the first president to visit Europe while in office. On June 14, 1922, Warren G. Harding became the first president to have his voice heard on radio while he was dedicating the memorial Francis Scott Key, the writer of the Star-Spangled Banner. Calvin Coolidge was the first president to be sworn in by a former president, William Howard Taft. After Taft left office, he would go on to become the Supreme Justice in 1921 and would swear in Coolidge in 1925. Herbert Hoover was born on August 10, 1874 in West Branch, Iowa, making him the first president to be born west of the Mississippi River. Franklin Delano Roosevelt became the first president to appear on live television in 1939. His speech at the 1939 World's Fair aired on NBC at 3:30 p.m. on April 30th. People must have really enjoyed seeing their president on TV for the first time. By the way, if this is your first time here and you're enjoying yourself, go ahead and subscribe if you don't want to miss more awesome videos like this one. Harry S. Truman was the first and only 20th century president not to have a college education. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the only president to serve in both World Wars. During World War I, he trained tank units, and during World War II, he became Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. John F. Kennedy was the first president to have a televised debate. During the 1960 presidential election, Kennedy and Nixon debated live on CBS in front of the entire country for the first time. Lyndon B. Johnson was the first president to appoint the first African-American Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court. Marshall was approved by a 69-11 floor vote in Congress. Richard Nixon became the first president to visit China and the USSR while in office. Nixon's visit to China in 1972 became extremely monumental, especially at the time of the U.S.'s strong stance against communism. After Spiro Agnew's resignation on October 10, 1973, Nixon replaced him with Gerald Ford as his vice president. Later that year, in August of 1974, Nixon resigned, leaving the presidency to Ford. This makes him the only president to have never been elected to the federal executive branch. Jimmy Carter was the first president born in a hospital at Lillian G. Carter Nursing Center on October 1, 1924. In his early career, Ronald Reagan was a well-known actor, and he is the only president to have a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. George H.W. Bush became the 11th director of the Central Intelligence Agency, making him the only president to do so. This also gave a very unique perspective compared to the past presidents when it came to receiving and providing intelligence. In 1994, Bill Clinton became the first president to send an email. The email was sent from clinton.pz@aol.com to the Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt. George W. Bush was the first president to have a Master in Business degree. Bush received his Master's in Business Administration from Harvard University in 1975. Barack Obama was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, making him the first president born outside the continuous 48 states. Donald Trump was the first and only president with no prior military or political service. Trump, although a very successful businessman, had never served in a political office outside of the presidency. Joe Biden is the first president to receive a Presidential Medal of Freedom. And in 2017, before leaving office, Obama awarded Joe Biden, current vice president, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, making him the only president to ever receive the award. And if you want to be the first to do something, you can be the first to click on this other awesome video right here, or you can be the first to subscribe right here. See you guys in the next one.